Good afternoon. So great to be here with you. All right, we have got things firing up here on building the perfect marketing tech stack. So we've probably set the expectations maybe a little bit high. Let me just put as a caveat here, perfect for you. So marketing tech. I think the best way I can sum it up is I'm a big fan of Tom Fishburne, Marketunist, every week. Does a fairly insightful, like Gary Larson-esque version of, marketing life. And so this slide where we found out that our marketing is ineffective and annoying to our potential customers. And the marketing tech person is like, hey, with the right software, we could annoy them more effectively. Okay, obviously we don't want to be doing that. So I've been at this intersection of marketing and technology for over 16 years here now. Ad Age has called me the godfather of MarTech, which I'm not quite sure if I should take that as a compliment, as some sort of like insult, a threat, like, should we A/B test an offer they can't refuse? But I've been writing the Chief MarTech blog for a number of years. I'm also the VP of Platform Ecosystem at HubSpot, where I help HubSpot integrate with an amazing ecosystem of MarTech and sales tech solutions out there, including Webflow, who's a great partner of ours. I've written a couple of books in the space here as well, too. Probably what I'm famous for, or maybe infamous for, is this crazy curated, and I use curated in scare quotes, collection of all the different marketing technologies that are out there. This started in 2011, trying to just catalog around 150 at the time, which seemed like a lot. Everyone's like, 150 marketing technologies. Man, this thing is going to consolidate fast. And of course, the exact opposite happened. We just got into this exponential explosion of technology. And in 2024, the count was over 14,000. That's not readable, is it? Here, let me zoom in. That's better now, right? Yeah, okay, actually, there you go. That's really the equipment you need to be able to take advantage of this. This has been crazy. No one would have predicted this. Essentially like 9,300% growth, over that 13-year period. And you can take some small comfort that this isn't just marketing. Pretty much every category in software has had this explosion. The very dynamics of software industries, have changed. But with those changes are also changes in how we run our businesses, how we manage this technology. And that's a big part of what building the perfect MarTech stack is about. It's figuring out how to manage this consistent change. Now, very often, people look at that insane landscape of all these little dots and make the point that it's actually not very reflective of the industry, because all those dots are largely the same unreadable size. If you were to organize companies in the MarTech landscape by, say, their revenue or market share, what you would get is you would get a long tail. There's a relatively small number of very large companies that are in the head, like Webflow, and Web Experience, HubSpot, and CRM. There's a number of great companies that probably in the hundreds, that are sort of in the torso, around 100 million in revenue or so. And then this massive, massive long tail of all these smaller different products. And there's so many different things in that long tail. I mean, you have folks who are gunning to disrupt companies in the head and the tail. You've got folks in vertical market specializations. You've got companies that are regional specialists. The best e-commerce solution in Poland. Turns out it isn't Shopify. All the way down to like people who are building applications inside the ecosystems, like app partners, in the Webflow ecosystem, app partners in the HubSpot ecosystem. And then all the way down at the end of the tail, even things I call hobby horses, like these early experiments of people trying things. Now, in general, when you hear about consolidation in the industry, and consolidation does happen, it's about this sort of pulling things. Everyone's trying to generally get pulled up that curve. And in the process, they either get merged or acquired, or they become a giant themselves, or they go out of business. But what keeps the size of the MarTech landscape so large is the fact that while there is consolidation constantly happening, new companies keep entering the space. And in particular, we saw a ton of this over the past year. One of the reasons we saw such a leap in the total count on the MarTech landscape this past year was because there were nearly 3,000 new products that were essentially AI native products. And again, most of these in the long tail, very small things, a lot of experimentations with LLMs, but nonetheless, products available out there in the landscape. And of course, at the same time, all the companies in the head and the tail, all the existing MarTech companies adding AI like crazy too. Very fun time. So that's like the market. But what about for us running these technologies? How does the stack look? One of the things that's interesting is over the years, my collaborator on the landscape, Franz Riemersma, and I, have also tracked something like 1,500 different marketing tech stacks. And there's almost a consistent distribution of what's in people's stacks. About 17% of their products, on average, over the past 7 years are, these large platforms in the head. Typically another third are products from the torso. And about 50% comes from these products that are in the tail. What's interesting about this is it's not that the same products that were there in 2017 are the same in 2023. It's that they evolve. And things that are in that tail, either they experiment and they go away, or they get incorporated into the torso and the head. But it's a constantly fluid and evolving stack. As you might imagine, in an environment where things are constantly changing, the ability to change and adapt is prized above almost every other characteristic. Martech.org, a great site, covers the Martech industry. Every year they do a survey of what they call the replacement survey. They ask, have you replaced a product in your MarTech stack in the past year? If so, what? If so, why? What were you looking for in the thing you then replaced it with? And they just came out a few weeks ago with this year's data. And the number one thing people are looking at is cost. Yes, in case if you were wondering, are we in 2024? We are. Cost, very important. Second most important thing, of course, is, that's the third most. Second most important thing, though, was integration capabilities and open API, only shortly followed by, improved customer digital experience. People look to have these things work together. And we'll talk about that a bit more. One thing that was interesting, by the way, in this replacement survey is they asked, you replaced something in your stack over this past year. Overall, did your stack grow or shrink? And 60% of the respondents said, no, actually, our overall stack actually grew. So even if we were replacing things, and maybe as part of that replacement, we were trying to do some consolidation of multiple tools, we likely added several new products in addition on top of that. Now, this is always a contentious thing of like, should MarTech stacks or tech stacks in general be consolidating? There are these SaaS management platforms out there that they connect to all your different software. They help you keep track of your licenses, and in aggregate, they have great information about what the actual size of tech stacks are. One company, Xylo, every year they publish these aggregate statistics, and in 2023, this was the data on. By the way, I should interrupt and say I throw a lot of various data slides at folks here. I think the whole deck here will be made available to you, so you'd be able to maybe even zoom in on that slide with all the little dots. All right. Let's say companies 500 to 2,500 employees in 2023 on average had 255 different SaaS subscriptions. CFO came in and is like, all right, we've got to do some belt tightening here. Let's get rid of things we don't need. Good news is in 2024, tech stacks did shrink. The thing is, they didn't shrink by that much. Even for, let's say that 500 to 2,500, they went from having 255 SaaS subscriptions to 245. Consolidation for the win. And the thing is, just like I mentioned that tail, the amount of things in the tail stays consistent, but what's actually there is constantly changing. Xylo also shared the stat that on average for companies in that size, they add 6.2 2 new SaaS subscriptions every 30 days. And the only reason it doesn't just keep growing infinitely is because they're taking things out on the other side. But it's fluid. And that really gets us into a really big shift that we are all wrangling with as we think about the perfect tech stack. And that is, I don't know, for years we talked about this idea of big data. Like, oh man, how do we do with the scale and complexity of all this data that we have to collect, store, and analyze? I think we have since shifted into a world where the real challenge is what I call big ops, which is the scale and complexity of all the different apps and automations that we have that are interacting with all of that data that we have in our companies. A more visual metaphor for this is, if the era of big data was, we would hike up, a professional Sherpa would help us hike up, to the mountains, peer into the deep waters of all that data to look for insights. Big Ops is like still this massive body of water, but it's more like an interactive water park because everybody is in there splashing around. This is the thing about Ops. It's not just analyzing data that's, at rest. It's actually doing things to actively work with this data and in the process create new data. And this is one of the reasons why we've had this explosion of Ops functions all throughout the business. You can pretty much, if you name any function inside a company, I guarantee you can add the word ops to the end of that word, and you will have a team out there. It's like, oh yeah, we're the finance ops folks, we're the people ops folks, we're the customer success ops folks. This is why it's a big ops environment. And there's definitely commonality that's shared among these, and one of them is how do they try and each bring order to the chaos of all that data and all of these different applications. And one of the ways we used to think about that was, consolidation. The way to bring order to the chaos is we have to get rid of a whole bunch of stuff and just consolidate down. I actually think, while consolidation has a role to play, the much more powerful force in our tech architectures is the idea of aggregation. And again, this is one of these things where it sounds sort of synonym-like, but I want to go into just a little bit about what the distinction is, because strategically they are very different. Consolidation is about reducing a large set of things down to a fewer number of things, or maybe even just one. Aggregation is more about, you still have that large set of things, and you're not necessarily getting rid of them, but you're finding a way to make them easier to consume or access or manage. And I want to give you a bunch of, real world examples from where this, originates from. Social media platforms are a great example of aggregators. If any of you follow Ben Thompson of Stratechery, he's the one I credit with this idea of aggregation theory. One of the places who it has applied was the social media platform, saying, okay, well, you've got things, like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube, very consolidated, by the way, as a platform. But how are they consolidating? Is they're aggregating the content from millions of social media creators. In fact, actually, the more social media creators you have being aggregated, the more valuable the platform itself becomes. We've seen this same thing with smartphone platforms, right? iOS and Android have essentially consolidated the world as platforms. But as part of their consolidation, they've enabled markets of literally millions of apps on top of them. You can even now start to move this to inside our tech stacks, right? Like data warehouses, I think, are a great example of something that has a relatively small number of leading players in the data warehouse space. What are they doing? Well, they're aggregating dozens, sometimes hundreds of different data sources and destinations throughout a company. Even things like, in my world of, CRM platforms, things like HubSpot and Salesforce and Dynamics, what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to aggregate data and interactions that are coming from potentially dozens or hundreds of different customer touchpoints. And the point I want to make here is this consolidation you see in the platforms is very much a function of their ability to aggregate, not consolidate, aggregate things on the other side of the equation. And I would propose that this is the pattern that is most valuable to us as we think about building the perfect tech stack inside our company. Is yes, we want to consolidate in the sense of getting rid of things we don't need or we don't use or are duplicates. But that is only going to get us so far, right? Like it gets us from 255 to 245. This other pattern of aggregation is to say like, okay, well, if we have a bunch of different data sources, or we have a bunch of different workflows, or we have a bunch of different experiences, can we have platforms that help us aggregate those so that we can manage them, we can orchestrate them, we can bring like a center of gravity, some coherence to it. And again, I know this is a very abstract chart, so what I wanted to do is give you just a bunch of different examples of aggregation platforms as I see them in tech stacks. Again, just a few examples, by no means comprehensive, but think about what's happening at the data layer. This is exactly what cloud data warehouses, things like Snowflake and Amazon and Databricks are all about, right? Is the more things you are feeding into a Snowflake and the more things that you allow to pull out of Snowflake, arguably the more value you get from Snowflake. That is an aggregation play. It's not trying to get rid of data sources. It's trying to make all of your data sources more usable. There's specialized versions of this with master data management and CDPs, and even in content with digital asset management. I would even argue like things like shared spreadsheets, are kind of like a micro version of an aggregation. I mean, what does like using Excel or Google Sheets let us do? It lets us, aggregate, data at a small scale and make it easier to consume. You go up to the workflow layer. This is where things like traditionally like iPaaS, integration platform as a service, or enterprise automation products, things like Workato. Again, the more things that you have in your tech stack that you're using one of these automation or integration platforms to connect together, the more value you are getting out of that aggregation platform. Then as you start to come up to this layer of like experiences, whether it's experiences for your employees or experiences for your customers, this is very much like, well, this is one of the areas where I would see Webflow, as being that platform to help us aggregate these experiences that we're delivering to customers. In the case of HubSpot, like CRM is an aggregation of data around customer touch points. And then even at this level of governance, all the stuff we have happening in these tech stacks, right? How do we like get our arms around these? You've got things like privacy and data governance platforms like OneTrust and DataGrail. Single sign-on is a great example of an aggregation platform, things like Okta. Even these SaaS management platforms like Xylo that I was sharing some of this data from. I mean, think about it. Like, part of the value of Xylo is the more tools you have in your tech stack, the more value you get out of Xylo by providing more organization and governance on top of it. And to me, the underlying principle here that going from consolidation to aggregation is that it gets us from a world where we used to think about tech stacks as being very fragile. Like if you would change something in the tech stack, everything was so tightly coupled, that, oh man, we changed this, it's going to like ripple off and like break these 10 other things. Well, this fellow, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, wrote a few books, Fooled by Randomness, The Black Swan. One of his books was called Anti-Fragile, and was this idea of like, hey, listen, fragile things break. Robust things tend not to break, right? They tend to be a little bit stable. Anti-fragile things, they actually get better when shocks and changes to the system happen. And this is where we are with tech. We know, boy, it's just changing fast. Like I can't tell you what you're going to want to add to your tech stack next year or the year after, but I can pretty much guarantee you, you're going to want to be adding things to your tech stack next year that are going to be different than what you have today. And so being able to design an architecture of a tech stack with these principles of anti-fragility, which to me is really what aggregation is enabling, is to allow you to be able to embrace that sort of fluidity and that constant change. Okay, so in building the perfect tech stack, we've looked at the whole landscape of things that are out there, large and ever growing. We sort of recognize like, okay, moving to this idea of aggregation patterns is perhaps a way to give us some cohesion to this within our own environment. But there's another thing about the tech stack that's probably the most exciting thing, which is tech stacks are increasingly not just what comes out of the box from commercial software, but it's what we build on top of them. And the highfalutin term for this is composability. It's become, once again, a buzzword in our industry. And it's one of those words that you can interpret in many different ways. Like, what is a tech stack? Well, it's a composition of multiple tools. You have platforms like composable CDPs, let you aggregate different data sources on top of them. But then even ultimately where composability really matters is for our business, right? We're trying to create a series of internal digital workflows or external customer experiences that are unique to our business. And they're composed out of whatever different sets of data or different set of services we want to bring together to create that experience or to create that workflow. Now, this is where things get interesting because there's only so much of that you can do through your own IT department before they just get absolutely overwhelmed. And so one of the most exciting trends to me over this past 10 years has been the slow evolution of things that we used to call no-code, low-code. And increasingly now we're starting to just recognize as one of the paradigms of generative AI interfaces, agents and whatnot, where I just start to describe what I want in natural language, and the software makes it happen for me. This is all about democratizing the capability for people even beyond core engineers and core IT to shape some of the customization of their workflows and their customer experiences. And this is a controversial concept for a number of reasons, but I think the best way to understand what's happening there is to lean on this model of disruptive innovation that was created by Clay Christensen. And I just want to walk you through this in this context. So the way Clay Christensen looked at this was, for any given space, like let's call it web experiences, you might have low-end use cases, things like, I need to build a landing page. You might have mid-range use cases of like, I'm going to want this like maybe interactive directory for people to pick, courses from an academy, all the way up to like high-end use cases of like, I've got my hall.com here and it's going to have this like, massive, interactive application. And it used to be like when you have software engineers who are the only ones who could really build those mid-range and high-end use cases, they actually didn't want to spend their time building landing pages. Any of you who have been in marketing and have gone to a web developer and said, hey, would you mind building me 100 different versions of this landing page? The reaction you may have gotten may have been less than enthusiastic. And so the whole thing about Christensen's disruptive innovation theory is when a disruptive innovation happens, it doesn't happen usually at that high end. It happens by going to these low-end use cases that, frankly, are underserved. These are things that, like, nobody else wants to build the 100 landing pages. But if we could have a disruptive innovation that could empower marketers to largely self-serve building those landing pages, well, kind of everyone is happy. The engineers didn't actually want to work on those. The marketer now finally feels like, unbottlenecked from this. And I'm just giving one example with web experiences. I mean, we see this across so many different capabilities, where the way disruptive innovation is happening is most of the things that are being empowered by these citizen tools, these democratizing tools, they're not capable of doing the mid-range or high-end use cases. But boy, do they help out with these low-end use cases, and there's so much untapped productivity there. Now, the other little secret of Christensen's model here is that over time, things do tend to keep getting better. And eventually, things like what we think of as no-code and generative AI are going to be able to support more mid-range and high-end use cases. But in those cases, the audience changes. It becomes less about the democratized citizen business user who's working with this stuff, and it actually becomes more of our engineers, who can take advantage of that. Now, again, I say this is controversial because usually when talk about empowering non-engineers, non-technical people to create things, there's like sort of a knee-jerk reaction of like, well, yeah, but they don't understand how to build software or how to do that the right way. And that's true. But what they do understand is they understand the domain. They understand the problem that they're trying to solve. And one of the biggest challenges that historically been in software creation is, yeah, the software engineers know how to create the software, but they don't necessarily know the domain problem. And you've had this communication challenge where the folks in the domain don't know quite how to communicate it, in a way that, a software engineer appreciates. And this is one of the great things that unlocking, even for the sake of prototyping some of these ideas, is it allows the business users to express things in a software way that then software engineers, should they want to take this to a larger case, have the ability to do so. This fellow, David, let me get his name, Peterson, right? David Peterson had this post a few years back about no code and empowering folks. And this one phrase that he had used really stuck out with me, that when the person who feels the pain is also empowered to build the solution, the result is magical and utterly unique. And this unlocks so much potential for businesses. We go from a mode where everything has to be bottlenecked through a centralized service bureau, where increasingly more and more things get decentralized into self-service. And the benefits of this is, in a self-service world, it can be faster. There's no waiting in the queue. You just go ahead and you do it. It changes the bandwidth of the number of things we can do at the same time. It changes, and this is where things get really exciting, the creativity. Because as you start to empower more and more people to create, they're going to bring a different set of ideas and a different way of approaching things that, frankly, the folks who do that all day, every day, might not have thought of. And because we learn by doing, by empowering people to do more of these things hands-on, we also accelerate the learning curve of what people throughout our company recognize as the power and potential of these technologies. And I put together a few visuals of this just because I wanted to drive home the point, right? That typical thing of okay, well, if I have an idea, I want to send it through a central service provider. I wait in the queue, eventually it gets billed, maybe there's some feedback, and it's done. Oh, and then if I want to change it again, I have to go back to the beginning and get in the queue again. Self-service just shortcuts all of that. You just start building it, you have feedback, you can iterate as much as you want. It also changes, again, this bandwidth component of, inherently central service things are serialized. As you enable more and more self-service, you're allowing things to be parallelized as well, too. Why is this so powerful? I think it comes down to this one concept more than anything else, which is the promise of the digital world for marketers had always been its malleability. This ability to change things and try new ideas quickly and inexpensively. The only problem was, it turned out while digital did make things faster and less expensive, we still very quickly ran into a whole bunch of constraints of just, well, how quickly and how cheaply. And this is what a lot of this low-code, no-code, Gen AI, the empowerment, democratization of folks, is it's enabling people to try more and more ideas quickly and inexpensively. And that matters because no matter what anyone else will tell you, marketing doesn't have a crystal ball as to what's going to work or what's not going to work. The reason I love this quote from Linus Pauling, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, it was asked, because he'd had a number of great ideas over the years. People are like, how do you come up with so many great ideas? And his answer was largely well, I just come up with a whole bunch of ideas, and I'm paraphrasing to say most of them don't work at all. But because I'm constantly coming up with these new ideas and trying things, I increase the odds of finding ones that are really going to work. And again, just to sort of emphasize this isn't about replacing the expertise or the care or the governance or all these things that we think of as the essential bedrock of why we have professional engineers, professional technical leaders, why we have architecture, why we have IT departments. All those things are more relevant than ever, right? We need these foundations, these aggregation platforms. Who are the architects of leveraging these? These are our core technical talent. It's the empowerment of the folks outside of that inner circle that's covering a very different set of low-end use cases. Things that are oh, well, this is actually something really simple, like a landing page. Or it's something we're only going to use internally for a little project. Maybe it's something that would only have a small number of users that it would serve. It wouldn't be worth, investing in a large production. Maybe it's going to be a short lifespan. Maybe we're going to create a little app for a session at a conference, and then once that session and conference is over, we're going to throw it away. So again, we don't want to invest a lot in it. Different use cases, like, hey, is this super sensitive data? Okay, that's a high-risk use case. If it's not super sensitive data, maybe it's low risk. And then this thing I was talking about, this idea that the communication between domain experts in the business and technical experts, in engineering, has been like, how do I translate those? When you have something that is ambiguous, the business user can't actually fully describe what it is they're thinking. Giving them the ability to use these democratized tools to help remove some of that ambiguity, to say like, no, okay, it's like this, changes the way in which we can then get to well-defined solutions. And the key thing to take away from this is the area that has been underserved and where there's so much unlock we can have through no code and things like AI over these next few years. All right, one last thing I wanted to share with you, and then I think we had a little bit of time for questions as well, too. Thank you all for sticking with me through wow, there were a lot of charts there for right after lunch. I hope you had some coffee there. All right, but one last chart, if you'll indulge me. And this is something we call Martech's Law, because actually we've seen it in marketing technology again and again. But this seems to be a little bit more of a universal truth, which is we're living in an age where technology is changing at largely an exponential rate. The simplest version of this would be to say Moore's Law, right? The doubling of computing power roughly every couple years. It's exponential. Organizations do not change at an exponential rate. If we're going to take a swagger at it, we might say it's a logarithmic change. That for the most part, change is really hard. And when you juxtapose these two curves, you realize why pretty much everyone in business feels like constant stress in today's environment. It's like having one foot on the dock and one foot on the ferry, as it's departing. And I've some bad news, which is there's no silver bullet to this. And again, what we're seeing right now happening with the rapid evolution of AI technologies and the relatively slow adoption of good AI marketing practices. It's a very concrete example of this. I call this the quintessential management challenge of the 21st century. And there is no silver bullet that's going to magically fix it. But there is some good news. There are two things you can do. One is you can be very strategic about which changes you embrace. And this is hard. This takes discipline. There's so many changes swirling around our companies right now, so many shiny objects to look at. We need to have the discipline about understanding what is our strategy? What is it that makes our business, where we're going to place our chips, of what makes us unique in the market? And embrace the changes that are most relevant to that and be willing to let a bunch of these other changes sail on by. And the second thing is to become a more agile organization, to recognize that the ultimate capability you need in today's environment is the ability to adapt. And the thing about this is you don't need to adapt at the high end of the curve, this exponential rate of technology change. The beautiful thing here is you only have to change faster than your competitors. It's like that, old joke about the two hikers in the woods, and they come across the bear, and the bear's going to charge them, and the one stops to put on their running shoes, and the other hiker is like, "What? You can't outrun the bear." And, the guy says, "Well, I just have to outrun you." By the way, this is a terrible friend to go hiking in the woods with. I mean, really. Yeah, sure, I've made better life choices there. But that is exactly the dynamic here. Is we're looking for the ability to just be able to change and adapt faster than our competitors. And if you can do both of those things at the same time, well, it's not a silver bullet, but it is a way to navigate through this incredible, scary, exhausting, wonderful time that we are living in. I end pretty much every presentation, I think now for the past 10 years, with saying there's never been a better time to be in marketing. This ability to be on the forefront of changing and redefining how our companies like reach and engage and delight customers. It's not easy, it's exhausting, but it's a gift to have this opportunity to innovate. And so I really hope that, yeah, if there's not one universal perfect tech stack, I hope some of these ideas are helpful to you in creating the tech stack that's perfect for you. So with that, I say thank you, and I think we'll have 5 minutes for any questions if you have like really hard. First question would be like, where are those little wafers outside? Okay. Yes? If tools... Oh, wait, I think you've got a amplification on the way.
So if tools are growing exponentially in terms of their how much new technology is available, how have you seen things like not just organizational ability to adopt them, but things like budgets? Because the MarTech landscape is not growing at exponential. Like the amount of budget available to go buy those tools is not growing at those exponential rates. So are you seeing kind of a compression of there's maybe a race to the bottom of like a lot more tools, but a lot relatively less budget per tool to be allocated, plus the complexity of adopting more and more of them? How have you seen that dynamic of, is the technology also is it outpacing our ability to pay for it, or businesses' ability to pay for it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say, well, first of all, just to disclaim, yeah, the landscape is no longer growing exponentially, but it's growing really. In fact, actually, for all I know, the year is still early. It might go back to an exponential growth. But I think, what I would keep in mind is that idea of that long tail. Because I would argue not only is that probably a distribution of things like market share and revenue, it's probably also a more or less swag version of the distribution of cost. And so I think what you will typically see inside an organization is, probably half their tech budget is with platforms and solutions in the head and the tail that tend to be relatively stable. They have to be stable. If we don't have like stable foundations, these aggregation platforms, everything starts to go to pot real quickly, And then I think in the long tail, this idea that like, okay, it's not that we're necessarily just adding tools, because the data, from like Xylo and others here show that no, actually, if anything, sort of the total number of tools that any one company actually purchases tends to be a little bit. We're seeing some, consolidation there. It's just the variety of tools that you have available to you in that long tail. They've what really have exploded. And very often, a lot of the ways I encourage people to think of these things is what's exciting in the tail is very often this ability to experiment with new things, new emerging things. This is a big part of what we're seeing with AI, is a whole bunch of these micro AI tools. They're not necessarily the tools you imagine you were going to want at the center of your stack over the next 5 years, but their ability to very quickly and inexpensively let you experiment, with something is a huge benefit. And the fact that you're perhaps experimenting with a different tool than your neighbor is doesn't really matter because they're at that, early stage. But yeah, the short answer is no, budgets are not increasing. If anything, we could take a poll survey, like a straw poll here in the room. I suspect for most folks, if anything, there continues to be sort of economic pressure on what your tech budget is. Great question. We have another one over here, and someone's running.
Thanks so much for the presentation. Really interesting to see the trends kind of at that macro level. One of the questions I had is with the proliferation of kind of no-code tools, we're seeing some interesting trends around companies building their own tooling in-house. I'm interested to know if that long tail, if you're seeing a trend there that more and more companies are replacing kind of the long tail of these smaller single-purpose tools with things that they're building in-house. I think Klarna was in the news recently saying, right, the same thing. They're going to replace Workday and Salesforce with their own stuff. I don't know whether that's realistic or just kind of one-off.
Yeah, well, wow, what a great news story. Yeah, and I think you're right. The Klarna story is interesting, at least in the near term. Probably not practical at that scale for most companies, but I think where you're going of saying, well, wait, in that long tail, and I haven't actually published this yet. This will be coming out in a big report we're doing in December, but we extended that graph with the long tail, and we put something beyond the long tail, which we refer to as a hypertail. And it's this idea that actually with a bunch of these tools, these platforms that you have, part of the capabilities they give you is it's not necessarily about building an entirely separate standalone product, but it's this ability to create these custom things, whether it's custom workflows and automations or custom experiences or stuff that are really unique to your business. They build on that foundation of an aggregation platform, so it's not rogue out there in the world, but it is something that's being crafted very uniquely to your business. And we think when you read about where things are headed with AI agents, I don't know if people are going to think about agents or the things agents do as software. It almost becomes like an ambient part of just how we work. But in a very real sense, they are like these little mini software apps that you see just have the potential to, explode out there. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. And I guess, unfortunately, with that, I see I'm at the time limit here, but I will be, as soon as I get this gear off, hanging outside, happy to answer any other questions one-on-one. Thank you so much for having me. Enjoy the rest of Webflow Conf.